Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this session of the third annual Spinal Cord Injury Investor Symposium. My name is Jack Allen, and it is my pleasure to be joined virtually today by Marco Sorani for this fireside conversation. We have a lot of ground to cover today, as we hope to touch on various topics, including potential endpoints and study design, the various populations with spinal cord injury, and some overarching thoughts on the opportunity for developing novel interventions for this population. Just briefly before we get started, given my role as an equity research analyst at Baird, I wanted to take a moment to remind anyone on the call to please refer to our published research or Baird's website for important disclosures surrounding companies potentially discussed during this event. Without further ado, Marco, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for the fireside chat today.
Thanks a lot, Jack. Yeah, I really want to thank you and the organizers for having me.
Yeah, it's an incredible event, the Spinal Cord Injury Investor Symposium, and I'm excited to be able to participate in the third annual event. Maybe to kick things off, Marco, I'd love to send it over to you just to provide the listeners with a bit of background on yourself and your role within the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure, I can give you a little bit of my professional and my personal background. So from a professional perspective, I did my graduate training at UCSF working with Jeff Manley, and for the last 20 years or so, I've been working in the biopharma industry, mainly in portfolio management and mainly in oncology drug development. From a personal perspective, I sustained a spinal cord injury about 31 years ago. My injury is a C6 motor, somewhat complete, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more later on in the session, and sensory incomplete. And I've also had a really wonderful opportunity to work with a lot of nonprofits in the spinal cord space, including NorCal SCI, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, Unite to Fight Paralysis, the Craig Nielsen Foundation, the Reeve Foundation, and the Miami Project. And hopefully some of the perspective I can give is really kind of what it is like to live with a spinal cord injury and to think about spinal cord injury research. For me personally, in addition to being paralyzed from the chest down, I've had to deal with all kinds of things, muscle atrophy, shoulder pain, the sleep that gets disrupted as a result of shoulder pain, edema in my legs, osteoporosis. I've been to the ER several times for urinary tract infections and heat stroke. So, the full gamut of the spinal cord injury experience. And all that said, honestly, I have to say I'm one of the lucky ones. I had a chance to finish my college education before I was injured. I have a career where I can really work mainly at a desk and at a computer. And I have a great network of family and friends to support me. So I know that there are a lot of people who are really struggling to get by, and I want to keep that in perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. Marco, I appreciate you sharing your background and a bit of your story there. I know we have a lot of different aspects to jump in here, given your unique expertise within clinical studies and portfolio management in the biotech industry. But before we jump into that, I wanted to keep it broad and big picture. In that regard, where do you see the highest areas of unmet need as it relates to potential interventions for spinal cord injury? Where can we improve care to the greatest extent in your view?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think a lot about Kim Anderson, who's a professor at Case Western Reserve University, published a paper a little over 20 years ago where she did a survey and she really laid out very clearly what the needs are in the SCI community. And what people said that they wanted was better hand and arm function and better bladder, bowel, and sexual function. And it's interesting because, I think very often the sexy endpoint that people want to see on TV is somebody walking again. And very often you see both in the private sector and in academia, that's kind of what's being chased. But I think increasingly now, hand function, bladder function is starting to get a lot more attention in terms of investment and research and progress in the clinic, which I think is great. I'd say in terms of unmet need, bowel function, sexual function, is still a really underrepresented area of research. And I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that a lot of mortality and morbidity in the SCI community still happens as a result of cardiovascular disease, respiratory infection, even pressure ulcers. The other thing, from my perspective, as somebody who's been injured for 31 years and now I'm 56 years old, there's not that much research going on in aging with a spinal cord injury. And so, we're doing a better job of keeping people around and alive, but all the, ongoing secondary health challenges that people face as they age is really important. And I mentioned a couple of the organizations that I work with. Organizations like U2FP and NASCIC are doing, I think, a really great job of linking researchers with people with lived experience to get that perspective on their research agendas.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important question to tackle. I know there are a lot of people that are designing interventions for this potential population, and they maybe don't have that lived experience. And speaking with people with lived experience, it seems like the unmet need is much more broad than movement-related endpoints, and that there's a number of different areas that are very interesting to study that you aptly laid out. I guess maybe diving in a little bit more as it relates to the unmet need in some of those areas. How do you think we should be measuring that in the studies? Any ideas as it relates to endpoints, or any thoughts around the breadth of endpoints that you'd like to see in clinical studies in spinal cord injury?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you can't study what you don't measure. And so I think one thing that's really important is to be collecting a broader set of endpoints. Now, I understand that as clinical protocols become more complicated, that does become more of a burden on patients and physicians who are trying to run these studies. But honestly, it's not that much more expensive or time consuming to add some of these endpoints to studies. And Jennifer Doolin, who's a professor at Texas A&M University, published a study a couple of years ago where she did this very comprehensive survey of clinical trials in the SCI space. And what she found is that most clinical trials only have a single primary endpoint and maybe one or two secondary endpoints. So not very much. And the other thing she found is that most clinical trials actually don't even post or publish their results. So I think that there's really a gap here in the collection and the reporting of endpoint data. If I look at a better example recently, looking at the Onward Medical recent Uplift clinical trial, where they looked primarily at upper limb function and also at some safety endpoints. They actually also captured a pretty broad swath of secondary endpoints, including pain, sleep, quality of life. So I think that that's starting to get at what we really are hoping to accomplish, which is really understanding more broadly what some of these interventions are doing in patient populations. Now, I think one of the challenges is trying to interpret what some of these endpoints mean. Looking at the Uplift study, for example, where they were looking at grasp strength and so on, some of these endpoints may not be obvious to the consumer or to the layperson. And so I think really laying out what those things mean for somebody on a day-to-day basis is going to be really important. I think one of the other challenges is that some of these endpoints can be a little bit subjective. So, for example, if you think about bowel function, there are a lot of different outcome measures that could relate to bowel function, but actually the industry has started to standardize. And if you look at the drug labels of recent drugs like Motegrity, Linzess, that have recently been approved in IBS and constipation, they use the same endpoints. So I think that there really is an opportunity to pick some and standardize on them.
Yeah. And another opportunity could be to study different endpoints in different subpopulations of spinal cord injury. I know spinal cord injury, and it's a broad conference that we're virtually attending right now, but it's a very heterogeneous population of people with lived experience with spinal cord injury. You can have injuries at different points within the spinal cord and different severities of injury as well. Like, how do you think about applying some of the things you just discussed as it relates to different endpoints, and which are maybe most applicable to different patient populations within spinal cord injury?
Yeah. Yeah, right. So SCI is a really heterogeneous condition and set of conditions. And when I gave you my personal introduction, I referred to myself as kind of motor complete and sensory incomplete. And I think that this concept of completeness of injury is really still very much of a gray area in the field. And I think that the more we can do to understand that, the more it'll help us understand kind of the underlying anatomy and biology, as well as then, what are going to be the right interventions and endpoints. I think right now still functional exams, that is like what can a patient actually do? That's still probably one of the gold standards. And then imaging and functional imaging is going to be, I think, another really important set of endpoints. Now, granted, those do become more expensive and time consuming, but I think those will be really important. So, I think that area, trying to understand complete versus incomplete injuries, that's a really important distinction in population. The other really important distinction, I think, is the acute versus chronic injury space. Now, I think most people with acute injuries ultimately will have chronic injuries. And so I think it's important to study the chronic injury space. But we have learned lessons from other disease areas, like stroke, for example, which is another condition that's highly heterogeneous, sudden onset. You need to figure out, how do you capture informed consent? How do you run a clinical trial in that kind of a space? But that's another population that I think is going to be still really important to try to understand in terms of neuroprotective interventions. So yeah, there is a lot of heterogeneity out there, but I think capturing a lot of data, especially now, because we're experiencing an AI revolution and a data science revolution. And so it used to be that the amount of data was really a barrier. I think now it really is becoming an opportunity. And then I think as we start to think about combination interventions, that also gets really hard, right? Especially if you're combining interventions where you don't understand them very well individually. And so I think starting with what's best understood and what's approved, I think is probably a pretty good strategy. So starting with best standard of care, rehab, and I think increasingly neuromodulation. And then on top of those, you can layer other interventions, cellular therapies, other neuroprotective interventions as well.
Yeah. So, and starting to try to find a somewhat homogeneous population within this heterogeneous larger cohort of people is maybe the most meaningful approach as well early on. And then how do you think about potential therapeutics? You touched on it a little bit, or interventions in different populations, but do you have any high level thoughts about what types of interventions would be best apt for certain subpopulations within spinal cord injury?
Yeah, well, I think right now what we're seeing is that neuromodulation and spinal cord stimulation, for example, they seem to be working better in injury incomplete populations. But I think that just really highlights the importance of multidisciplinary interventions. So, if you could layer on a cellular therapy to turn a complete injury into an incomplete injury, and then layer on the neuromodulation and the rehab on top of that, then, I think that seems like it could be a rational approach.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The other aspect of study design is also, as you say, providing the best supportive care. That current supportive care, though, can have impacts as well on the well-being of the person in the clinical trial. How do we approach that as it relates to controlling the clinical studies and thinking about the added noise that changes in standard of care can have over the course of the trial?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you raise a good point about noise in a clinical trial. And so I think, it's probably pretty appropriate to still have very clear inclusion exclusion criteria when you're designing a clinical study. But I think that also makes capturing real world data even more important. So, after you've run the clinical trial and hopefully something actually starts to get used in the clinical domain, then I think it really is the responsibility of physicians and surgeons out there who are using these interventions to actually capture data on them. I think in particular, there's a lot of work being done with implanting neuromodulation devices, cellular therapies, and a lot of that data is not reported or published. Personally, I would really urge those physician scientists to be sharing and reporting that data because we have to learn from these experiences in a heterogeneous environment so that we can better design clinical trials in the future that are going to be more likely to be successful.
Yeah, yeah, and the participants in those studies, I'm sure, entered the trials with the understanding that it would help push forward science. And I'm sure, regardless of the depth of sharing, it is still pushing forward the science. But getting that out there in the public domain as much as possible will help the broader field move forward. That touches on another question I had beyond the clinical study design and the endpoints. You're someone with substantial expertise in the biotech industry, and I'm sure you've seen a bunch of technological innovations over the course of your career. Where do you think we sit as it relates to innovation in spinal cord injury? And what do you see as the key catalysts that we need to essentially look at as pushing the field forward and really coming across the leap with a number of new innovations?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly one really important factor right now is just the funding situation. So I think spinal cord injury is really pretty drastically underfunded if you look at the burden of disability. It's a condition where there often is a very young age at incidence and a relatively normal life expectancy. And so that results in a lifetime cost of disability that's really pretty high. And I think the WHO did a study where they looked at over 200 different conditions, and they identified that cervical spinal cord injury was the second highest disease burden out of over 200 conditions that they assessed. So I understand that there's sort of a very broad reduction in biomedical funding and research across the board. It's not just spinal cord injury, but I think we're being penny wise and pound foolish in a way because we're just going to incur far greater cost of health and social programs compared to what it would take to improving people's outcomes early on. So I think we just need to see a much bigger federal commitment to funding. The other thing I think I'd say as a key catalyst is I'd love to see better collaboration across researchers, especially given that we are at a time of scarce resources. If you look in PubMed and you look for systematic reviews or meta-analyses, so many of them have inconclusive results and they report low quality evidence. And I think the problem is that we're incentivizing people to publish quickly. And that's the universities, the journals, the granting organizations. And really what we should be emphasizing is collaboration on bigger, better, higher quality studies. Um, I referred to a study that Jennifer Doolin published a few years ago. I know that she and her team are also in the process of working on some analyses that track where the SCI research funding is going. And that kind of a tool should be a really important enabler of collaboration across institutions. Another person I'd like to highlight in terms of supporting collaboration is Adam Ferguson at UCSF, who works with the Open Data Commons and also with the Track SCI initiative. And I think these kinds of projects that bring together lots of different institutions to build up that sample size, standardize across endpoints, that's going to be absolutely critical for moving the field forward.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. And I would also echo that I think events such as this also bring people together around a common cause and help drive conversation, which should meaningfully move the field forward. I think it's a really exciting time in that light as it relates to the spinal cord injury space and these symposiums that have been going on for a couple of years now. Marco, I know you have quite a bit of experience in the biotech industry, helping allocate resources across different clinical study programs. I wanted to send it over to you to give a second to provide an overview of spinal cord injury and what type of potential reward there could be for people that are able to drive meaningful innovation. I think it's often overlooked the potential significance of the financial opportunity here as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's important to make a distinction between early stage research and late stage research because you do have to get to that proof of concept to de-risk the intervention. And then at that point, the investment starts to become a lot more attractive. But if you think about some interventions that I would consider to be more late stage, spinal cord stimulation, some rehab interventions, I think the valuation for those kinds of projects is actually quite attractive. Even though it's potentially a somewhat small initial commercial market, you have a high likelihood of success, and you know that you can probably conduct a study with not too many patients, and it's not going to be that long, and so you're not looking at a very significant cost, and so the valuation I think is generally going to be pretty attractive for those kinds of studies. I think the other thing to think about is that identifying spinal cord injury as a small market, I think, is actually a misconception because SCI is really, I think, a collection of syndromes. And there's a lot of overlap with other neurodegenerative diseases. So, you think about some of the mobility issues that you see in SCI, but you also see them in other areas like stroke and spinal muscular atrophy, where spinal cord stim has shown to work. You think about a condition like neurogenic bowel, but you see that in Parkinson's patients. And then you even think about other areas outside of neuroscience where we've seen that cellular therapies are starting to work in ophthalmology and other areas. So I think that there is a lot of overlap. And I think spinal cord injury could really be a stepping stone into some of these other areas. And I think the other thing that we're seeing is that in the last few years, there have been quite a few FDA drug approvals in related neurodegenerative conditions, many approvals in MS. We're even starting to see approvals in areas like Alzheimer's and ALS, which really up until now have been drug graveyards. And then, some smaller indications like ataxia, I think Rett, which I know you have worked in, myasthenia gravis. So, I think I think it's becoming a more attractive space to invest in. And then, maybe I think the final point I might make would be that if an intervention like BCI, brain computer interfaces, can work in spinal cord injury and other neurodegenerative diseases, and eventually actually become almost maybe like a broad consumer market application to be a general interface into technologies, whether it's your computer or your cell phone, then really the market becomes huge. But that's probably a little bit down the road.
Yeah. And then you talk a lot about the opportunity for interventions to be initially investigated in spinal cord injury and then use that as a beachhead to branch out into additional areas of focus. But I'm sure there's also an opportunity to repurpose some meaningful interventions into the spinal cord injury population as well. Have you considered that motion as it relates to innovation?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the work that's being done in the rehab space and being brought into spinal cord injury is probably a good example of that, right? I mean, I think that the field of gerontology and aging, that's we've learned so much from that population. We've learned a lot from um, the population of people who were injured as a result of involvement in the military, and so a lot of those innovations do get brought back to work with people who have spinal cord injuries or other similar situations.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's incredible how innovative the drug development industry can be across all different spaces. And when you find a novel technology such as a cell therapy, as you say, maybe it's applicable in another cell type, and then you bring that technology towards spinal cord injury, and you can meaningfully de-risk it more broadly for other cell types beyond spinal cord as well.
Yeah.
So that'd be very interesting to follow moving forward. I know we touched on a number of topics today, but I wanted to take a minute to really round it out with some positive notes. What gives you the most excitement as you look at spinal cord injury at this point and you look
Yeah.
forward?
Yeah. Well, I think spinal cord stimulation is one of the most exciting interventions that I've seen in the last 30 years since I've been injured. I think a lot of the work coming out of the Edgerton and Harkema labs, and now companies like Onward, Anuvo, Spinex. These are companies that are going to make a significant difference in people's lives in the very near term. I think the thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is that spinal cord stim is still on sort of like version 0.1. It has a lot of optimization that still needs to happen. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing that. I'm looking forward to seeing improvements in non-invasive and minimally invasive approaches to spinal cord stim too, because there just are a lot of cost and safety advantages compared to some of the more invasive interactions. Um, and so I think we're just going to need to figure out a regulatory model and a reimbursement model to allow this to happen in a fast and cost-effective way. I think we need to recognize, maybe similar to the field of oncology where I do a lot of my work, is that the SCI population has a different risk-benefit trade-off. They are willing to take on a lot more risk for a little bit of benefit because there just has not been anything available for decades. The other thing that I'd really like to see is sort of a whole new generation of physical therapists being trained to get ready for this tsunami of spinal cord stim rehab. It's going to be needed, or I hope it's going to be needed. And then finally, I'd really like to see researchers and companies publish their protocols for spinal cord stim because there's so much variability in all of the kind of bioelectrical, biomechanical engineering of duration, amplitude, wavelength, intensity, location of the electrodes. So, again, I think that there's a lot that we're going to learn as we go through some of these early iterations of the therapies. I guess the other thing that I think would be pretty exciting to keep an eye on would be some of the more traditional interventions. The other big change since I was injured 30 years ago has been in surgery. Back when I was injured, you would typically wait a couple of weeks before you would do that initial spinal decompression surgery. And the thinking was that you wanted to let the inflammation abate. But in fact, what was happening is that the inflammation was killing neurons. And so now people will do a spinal decompression surgery much earlier. And what I'm hearing and seeing is that there are more incomplete injuries as a result. And so that's another really good benefit from theoretically a very traditional intervention.
Yeah, that's a great anecdotal story there that you share, and it's incredible how much the field continues to advance, and hopefully, as you say, with larger data sets and more data sharing, we can continue to press the field forward. And it seems like the regulators are somewhat open as well. I was on a roundtable with the FDA on more of the cell and gene therapy space, which is an area that I follow very closely, broadcast this morning. And it seems like this new administration at the FDA is going to be very open to listening to people with experience with these ailments and taking their input into account to help drive progress forward. So hopefully we'll have some meaningful strides made over the next couple of years here.
Yes, I hope so. It's going to take all of us to work together on it.
Yeah, definitely. Marco, thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and thank you to all that had a chance to listen. Both Marco and myself are always available should you be interested in touching base and discussing more. But thank you all for taking the time to join us for the session at the third annual Spinal Cord Injury Investors Symposium.
And thanks to you, I really appreciate the conversation.